So Booksmart is a thing. If you haven't heard of this one, that's not surprising for a number of reasons. It was a little festival darling that only made a few waves when it was released. It has this indie movie feeling, but it's not an overly self-indulgent art film. In fact, it's a pretty straightforward comedy film. It's probably the best comedy movie I've seen in a long time, but it's just a comedy. And that's sort of the problem. This movie had been on my radar for a long time. Reviews and recommendations that I'd read or received continued to tell me that not only was it a good time, but it was genuinely funny and particularly smart for the comedy genre. Even with this praise, I did the whole thing where it was on my list, but I kept putting it off. Oh, come on, you do that too. You can lie to me, but don't lie to yourself. But just recently, I got around to finally watching this movie, and it was so good. And not just as good as people said, but it had way smarter characters than other comedy films of this type. The jokes were funny, the bits were raunchy, and some sections were downright hilarious.
Fuck you, George.
It sparked just the right balance of interesting characters that are quirky without being unrealistic or unlikable, and bizarre, almost surrealistic events that are still relatable despite being hyperbolized. But of course, this begs the question, if this movie was so great, and it was, why are the only people who are talking about it those who have already seen it? And it's not because of the indie darling status. Lots of movies get their start at festivals and branch out from there. The real problem is one that I have already alluded to, but you may have actually come across this either anecdotally or by following the movie industry. And this problem is that comedy as a genre is dead. Those are the headlines, not my words, and of course they're sensationalized. Comedy is in fact not dead, but in recent years there has been a significant decline in the amount of quality blockbuster comedy movies. And it gets stranger still because no one really seems to know why. And that in itself has me curious, especially when movies like Booksmart or Good Boys are out and they're hilarious. So what happened to the blockbuster comedy? I have a few theories, but I'm not conceited enough to think that I have a definitive answer, and nor did I come up with these all on my own, so keep in mind that this is just my opinion and a lot of it is speculation. I think the decline of comedy movies in the box office has to do with the way that audiences watch movies, comedy as a genre in film, and the way that comedy movies are viewed and handled by the studios. And for the sake of ease, I needed a movie to use as an example to prove my point. And so today, I want to talk about Booksmart. Booksmart began as a screenplay that surfaced way back in 2009. The title was well received and was placed on the Blacklist, which is a confoundingly named list of highly rated but as of yet unproduced movies. In 2014, Suzanne Fogel rewrote one of the characters and the central motivation for the story, and the movie was eventually pitched to actress Olivia Wilde, who had expressed an interest in directing. Wilde then asked Katie Silberman to update the movie to present day and add a few more surprises. After the rewrites were completed, Caitlin Denver and Beanie Feldstein were cast as Amy and Molly and even lived together in an apartment for 10 weeks to really get to know each other. To support them, a whole range of other teenage actors and a not so small handful of famous actors were tapped both on and off screen. I know people are often put off by his inclusion, but Will Ferrell helped produce this movie. The film made some noise at a few festivals before it was given a wide release back in 2019, but despite all the praise, the movie unfortunately underperformed at the box office. Here's your spoiler warning because you likely haven't seen this movie, and you really should see this movie. Molly and Amy are two high-achieving young women who are about to graduate high school and head off to Ivy League schools and reap the rewards of 4 years of hard work and determination. But on the last day of class, Molly confronts some of her underachieving classmates only to find out that they are not in fact slackers, and her notion of working hard to the detriment of her social life and enjoyment in order to get into great schools was a delusion.
I'm incredible at hand jobs, but I also got a 1560 on the SATs.
With only a single night before graduation left, the duo are determined to have one night of fun to prove to themselves and their peers that they can be fun and be smart. However, because they have spent most of their time working and not socializing, they are not particularly friendly with their classmates and must scour the town in order to find the party being held at the popular Nick's house. The pair wind up at several different kinds of parties and get into some crazy situations with even more interesting characters, one involving a ridiculous drug-induced stop-motion Barbie fever dream, but they eventually find their way to the party where both girls realize that their judgment of others has alienated them from their classmates and caused them to spend too much time underappreciating each other. They argue and Molly leaves. Amy, however, stays, and when the cops show up, she wants to do something bold and has them chase her so her classmates can get away. The next morning, Amy awakens in the drunk tank and Molly comes to get her so the two of them can graduate together. They manage to make it just in the nick of time so Molly can give her valedictorian speech, but she instead delivers a heartfelt apology and affirmation to her graduating class. And instead of a heartfelt goodbye at the end at the airport,
I can be the last one on the plane. What's wrong with you? You want to get pancakes?
That's my kind of ending. In order to understand why trends occur in film watching, I think it's important to look at as many angles as possible. Sometimes corporations and studios like to pull data or ideas out of their asses when no such problems exist in the first place. Let's not forget that video game publishers just decided that horror games were not popular. So is this a case of studios and executives making the decision that comedies are no longer what the general population wants to watch in theaters? Well, based on the fact that there have been legitimate attempts to produce and market some big budget comedy films, I would argue that this is not the case. Studios have often relied on one or two big comedy movies every year at the box office. The thinking is that not everyone is into high-concept sci-fi or fantasy or teen romance or Oscar bait, and so each studio usually has a comedy movie. In recent years, movies like Blockers, Game Night, and Tag were all run-of-the-mill comedies that were released. They weren't the smartest or funniest comedies, but none of them were bad movies by any means, and all of them were underperformers. So if the studios are legitimately making comedy movies, for better or for worse, why are people not watching them? Let's get the obvious answer out of the way. There was a global pandemic that drastically affected how businesses like movie theaters were and are run. So people are not keen to go out and watch a movie in a public place where tens, if not hundreds of people have put their butts and who knows what other kind of sticky movie theater substance on the same seat you're now sitting in. Yeah, sorry for ruining theaters for you, but those places were already pretty nasty before the pandemic. But even before this global crisis, people were less inclined to go watch comedies in theaters. All three of the movies I just mentioned, as well as Booksmart and Good Boys, were all released in or before 2019, a year before the pandemic. And it wasn't as though people were not going to the theaters. Avengers Endgame is the highest grossing movie of all time and was released in 2019. So it wasn't as though people were not willing to go to the theaters and dip into their savings account for the chance to eat stale popcorn while watching some purple dude snap his fingers. Besides superhero movies, many genres continued to do well at theaters pre-pandemic. In fact, the only genre that seemed to be failing was the comedy. Except, I don't think that's really true at all. Streaming is a thing now, and this is where I think audiences actually prefer to watch their comedies. There isn't a nice way to say this, so I'll just come out and say it. The majority of comedy movies are not particularly smart or well-written movies. With the exception of a few selected films, comedy movies are usually about a group of idiots doing idiotic things. Even Booksmart, which I maintain is smarter than most comedies, is really only clever because its characters and dialogue are good. Most of the movie plays out with the same kind of coming-of-age drama and raunchy hormonal drug-induced hijinks as any other comedy movie. I'm loath to make this comparison, but I think it's worth noting that the basic outline of Booksmart is the same as Superbad, which in turn is pretty much the same as the greatest coming-of-age story of all time, Stand By Me. Of course, there are differences between all of these movies, and they're important differences, but on the whole, when you watch a comedy movie, you don't expect to be presented with a high-concept film that is going to make you really think about what's happening on screen. Not that this is a bad thing, and not that you have to analyze everything, or not that you couldn't overanalyze things. I mean, that's basically all I do on This Is a Thing. But comedy movies are feel-good, and I don't know about you, but I often feel really good just watching movies at home. I'd like to say that the reason these movies are underperforming at the box office is that audiences are getting smarter and expect more from their movies, but I think that would be giving people too much credit. Comedy movies are a staple of the movie industry, but because streaming services allow people to watch them from home, people are not forced to go to the theaters to watch a movie that isn't particularly visually astounding or cinematic. Don't get me wrong, going to the theater can be an awesome experience despite the warm seats and bazillion-dollar snacks. You can always sneak your own food in anyway. But the theater is and historically has always been a place of spectacle. I talked about this before in the Spectacular Spider-Man episode.
What will we do now that people can see picture shows right in the comfort of their own homes? I've got an idea. Let's give them something that those little screen networks can't even hope to accomplish. We already have bigger screens. Let's put it to good use by creating larger-than-life epics.
Thus, we got the sword and sandal epics like Ben-Hur and Cleopatra. All the spectacle and grandeur you can conjure up and plaster on a huge silver screen, thanks to expensive projectors, kept people going to the cinema. Streaming has caused another reckoning for the movie industry, in that once again the domain of the theater has become smaller as home entertainment has become more accessible, and the latest casualty has been comedies. There's nothing wrong with comedy as a genre that made people adverse to it all of a sudden. Movies like Booksmart prove that funny movies are out there and can be smart and can continue to thrill audiences. But another issue that I think affects comedy viewing is the hazy parameters around what comedy is. As a genre of movie, I think you know what it is that I'm talking about, but to come up with an exact definition of what makes a comedy movie is difficult. Film critic and scholar Jeff King argues that the term comedy to describe a genre is inaccurate, as comedy is just one aspect of any kind of art. He uses the word word mode to describe comedy in any part of the craft of filmmaking. Comedy as a genre was defined by the use of this comedic mode in writing and applied to the coming-of-age narrative, exemplified by Stand By Me, and then just placed in different contexts. Without a Paddle is just Stand By Me but with an emphasis on comedy rather than drama. Anything Judd Apatow did is Stand By Me but with adult slackers. All three parts of The Hangover are just Stand By Me but where they're hoping they don't find a dead body. But more recently, comedy has been applied to movies outside of this coming-of-age template much more regularly. Most of the Marvel movies have a fair amount of comedy written into them, and Deadpool takes this to the next level as a comedy about a superhero. Comedy in a horror movie can be a great way to relieve tension and undercut expectations, so audiences are perhaps not interested in the silly circumstances of regular people in order to laugh, so much as watching their favorite superhero crack one-liners, and in an arguably smarter fashion than the traditional comedy. This isn't to say that comedy as a genre is dead and gone. On television, comedy shows are hugely popular. People continue to rewatch The Office or Friends with an almost cult-like devotion, and shows like Community often appear on the most watched or top 10 lists. New shows too, like Ted Lasso or The Good Place, are feel-good laugh fests that people can't get enough of. So it wasn't like the Western movie-going audience decided that laughter was no longer something they were interested in out of nowhere. They just consume it in a very different way, and usually on streaming services. Another potential effect on the genre is how audiences react to the reality of the world they live in. In a kind of perverse inversion of what one might think of as common sense, when things in society look bleak, audiences don't look for lighthearted films, but trend towards genres like horror. With politics in the West causing a lot of tension and then the pandemic hitting, things have been hard for people. Really hard. In the past, when the world has looked unfriendly, more depressing films and horror movies have often performed exceedingly well as people look for catharsis in the art they surround themselves with, instead of the false hope from some silly comedy movie. People want to commiserate with their on-screen counterparts, and this could be another cause in the lack of interest in comedy movies. Earlier I had mentioned the disappointment from studios in the performance of their big-budget comedies. Booksmart underperformed at the box office in its first week by making only $8.7 million in its first weekend. $8.7 million?! How the fuck is that underperforming?! Look, I get it. The movie industry makes projections about what it thinks movies should make, and Booksmart was projected to make $12 million in the first weekend, but the movie's budget was $6 million and it made back its money and then some in just 4 days. In total box office revenue, Booksmart made $24 million back. That's a huge amount of money and 4 times what it cost to make the film. The fact that this is still underperforming in the studio's eyes is mind-boggling to me. It probably did not perform to the expectations of the studio based on how past films of its genre did, but I don't know if I would call $24 million in global box office revenue on a $6 million investment a bad thing. Deadpool and Lady Bird both proved that R-rated comedies like Booksmart and Good Boys can do well at the box office, but you have to treat them differently. Comedies are likely never going to be the big moneymakers that superheroes or fantasy or whatever the next fad is, so treating them the same way is only going to set them up for failure. Many critics that praised Booksmart claimed that if the movie had been given a staggered release date like its predecessor Lady Bird, it may have gained more momentum in marketing through word of mouth, which would in turn have boosted its overall box office sales. But that isn't how studios operate. If comedy movies aren't going to meet projected sales, then there's no point in making them because a movie is only as good as its opening weekend. The idea that comedy is dead is in itself kind of funny. Comedy as a genre is alive and well, but it has changed as audiences have changed. With more people streaming for their feel-good films, there isn't the same desire to go to the theaters to see comedy as there is with epic spectacles or dramatic character pieces. But on those streaming platforms, comedy movies are still being made and comedy TV shows are thriving because of their lower budget and the ability to create long-running laughter over the course of multiple seasons. The result is that comedy isn't dead, but comedy movies are dead at the box office, and only according to studios. Comedy is alive and well. Movies like Booksmart just prove that. Perhaps it's the industry's perception of the genre that needs to die. And that is why I think Booksmart is indicative of why comedy isn't dead, and the idea that the opposite is true, well, that's just laughable. Here are my stray thoughts. I did think about writing this episode about Good Boys or Lady Bird, but the statistics around Booksmart underperforming worked better for the argument I was making. Also, the Barbie doll drug trip had me in stitches. I also love that this movie was about 2 female characters who loved each other no matter what and continued to be feminist even after learning to check their moral superiority. That's a pet peeve of mine, and I think this movie nails it without undercutting any of the character growth or feminist discourse for the purposes of comedy. It's also just a genuinely funny movie that too many people missed in the theaters. So like all comedy, you can go stream it right now. Hey, thanks so much for watching that video. Don't forget to hit that like button like you're on your own Barbie doll fever dream drug trip. I was really impressed with that pool scene that's all shot underwater. It's like a metaphor for puberty in itself. Don't forget to check out our other channel for more conversations about movies, and subscribe to the Cinemasters for more episodes of This Is a Thing, the long and the short of it, and whatever else we got going down, right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.